On February 19, 2026, the flood barriers of Venice rose for the 30th time in 23 days. The system was engineered to close about 5 times a year. That gap between design and reality is why engineers are now pushing a plan that sounds like satire: drill deep beneath the lagoon and pump seawater into the ground. Not to drain the city, to lift it. Could that actually save Venice? To understand why anyone would propose lifting a city, we have to understand what the barriers cannot do. Venice is guarded by MOS, a €6 billion machine of 78 steel gates lying flat on the seabed. Every time it closes, it seals the lagoon shut. The tides that flush out waste and carry in oxygen stop dead. So does shipping into the port the region depends on. Each closure costs roughly €200,000 and deploys around 100 operators. Used a few times a year, that is a bargain. Used constantly, it slowly strangles the very thing it protects. A lagoon sealed for days at a time cannot clean itself. The waste that normally washes out with the tide would simply stay. And Venice would need a treatment system for its sewage and large-scale pumps to control the water level inside. And there is no second system behind it. Let's look at the map. Venice stands in a shallow lagoon, separated from the Adriatic Sea by thin barrier islands broken at 3 points, the inlets of Lido, Malamocco, and Chioggia. Across those 3 gaps lie the gates, each about 20 meters wide and weighing up to 350 tons. When forecasts predict a tide of 110 centimeters above the reference level, roughly 43 inches, compressed air empties the water-filled gates and buoyancy swings them up into a wall in about half an hour. Below that threshold, they stay down on purpose. St. Mark's Square, the lowest ground in the city, starts flooding well before the trigger. That was always the plan. The gates were built for the exceptional, never for the everyday. The problem is that the everyday keeps climbing, and the reasons are a century old. Venice rests on millions of wooden piles driven into soft sediment, and over the 20th century, the city lost roughly 25 centimeters of height relative to the sea. About half was the water rising. The other half was the ground sinking, much of it self-inflicted. From the 1950s, industrial groundwater pumping at Marghera, on the mainland edge of the lagoon, pulled the land down by several millimeters a year until authorities halted it around 1970. The lost ground never came back, and the reason it didn't will decide near the end of the story whether the boldest rescue plan Venice has ever considered can work at all. Then on November 4th, 1966, a 194-centimeter tide drowned the city for a day and turned a chronic nuisance into a national emergency. It still took until 2003 for barrier construction to begin, launched by Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi and Veneto's governor, Giancarlo Gallan. The price roughly doubled on the way to $6 billion. Part of the reason was engineering. A larger part was crime. On June 4th, 2014, Italy's financial police arrested 35 people connected to the project. Prosecutors described a system of inflated invoices that siphoned public money, roughly €25 million, into accounts abroad, feeding bribes and illegal party financing across more than a decade. Venice's sitting mayor, Giorgio Orsoni, was placed under house arrest and resigned within days. Gallan, the man who had launched the project, later accepted a plea deal. The scandal deepened delays the project could not afford. On November 12, 2019, with the gates built but not yet operational, a 187-centimeter tide, the second highest ever recorded, swept through about 80% of the historic center into shops, churches, and ground floor homes, causing damage estimated around $1 billion. When the gates finally rose in earnest on October 3, 2020, they worked. The city stayed dry through a tide that would once have flooded it. Then the real escalation began. Not a single flood, but the calendar itself. In its first 5 years alone, MOS was raised to stop 108 separate high water events. Then came the start of 2026. 30 activations in 23 days, a stretch the head of Venice's tide monitoring center, Alvis Papa, called absolutely exceptional, while warning that within about 30 years, the gates may be needed every single day. So here's a question worth sitting with. How many closures a year would you tolerate before a gate becomes simply a wall? That trajectory is why Pietro Teatini, a hydrologist at the University of Padua, wants to change the one variable nobody has touched, the height of the city itself. His idea comes from an odd place, the gas storage fields of the Po Valley. Engineers there pump natural gas into deep reservoirs every summer and draw it out every winter, and the land above measurably breathes with the cycle, rising as the reservoirs fill, settling as they empty. Teatini spent 2 decades studying that breath and asked what would happen if it never exhaled. His plan: drill roughly a dozen wells in a ring about 10 kilometers across, down to saline aquifers 600 to 1,000 meters below the lagoon, far beneath any freshwater supply. Seawater would be pumped in slowly, at low pressure, gently inflating the deep sand layers. The ground above would rise evenly, by an estimated 25 to 30 centimeters over about a decade. In effect, Venice would wind back a century of sinking for a fraction of what the barriers cost. There is, however, a risk that gets almost no airtime. The lift has to be uniform, because a city of brick towers and marble facades does not forgive being tilted. Inject too fast or at too much pressure, and the rock can fracture. A concern raised publicly by geoscientist David Dobson of University College London. And this is where Marghera's lesson returns. The aquifers compacted by those decades of pumping never reinflated, because compressed ground is permanently deformed. The same physics that made the sinking irreversible means a mistake down there could be irreversible too. Even if everything works, 30 centimeters buys decades, not centuries. Teatini himself calls it a bridge, combined with most, perhaps 50 years of viability. 50 years to decide what exactly? In April 2026, a study in Scientific Reports led by climate scientist Piero Leonello, with Teatini among its authors, mapped every long-term pathway Venice has. Their estimate, with major additional measures, raising the ground itself among them, the open lagoon can be defended up to roughly 1.25 meters of sea level rise. Somewhere between 0.75 and 1.75 meters of rise, the authors estimate that strategy reaches its limit. What follows is ring dikes cutting the city off from its own lagoon, or permanent dams sealing the lagoon from the sea, and if the water keeps climbing beyond that, retreat, moving people and monuments inland. Each sacrifices something real: the port, the lagoon's ecosystem, or the living city itself. Under today's emissions policies, the authors judge the current strategy likely to hit hard limits this century. The implication fits in one line: no pathway preserves everything that makes Venice what it is. The only open question is which Venice comes next. The next step, if it comes, is deliberately small. A test in another part of the lagoon with fewer wells, pumping seawater for 2 to 3 years to see whether the ground behaves the way the models predict. Teatini puts the cost of that test at 30 to 40 million euros. Proposed, but not yet approved or funded. There is precedent. Tokyo stopped its own subsidence last century by halting groundwater extraction, and in 1971 and 1972, on the abandoned lagoon island of Poveglia, a 900 square meter test plot was lifted almost 10 centimeters by injecting a clay and cement slurry beneath it. But doing that deliberately across an entire living city would be without precedent at this scale. And nothing moves until regulators, funders, and the city agree. If the pilot succeeds, Venice becomes the first city in history to lift itself. If it fails, the barriers keep going up, more often every year, until the gates are simply a wall. Either way, the paths the study mapped are still waiting further down the road. So this is the real question: pump seawater under a 1,600-year-old city to buy it 50 more years, or spend that money now on whatever comes after Venice as we know it? There is no version of this story where nothing changes. The sea has already made its decision. Now Venice has to make one too.